The sun rose slow over the dry Texas plains, pouring molten gold over a land so thirsty it cracked beneath your boots. Dust blew in lazy circles across the Carver Ranch, where fences sagged, wells ran dry, and the only sound was the wheezing of a windmill that hadn't worked right in months. In the midst of that desolation stood Luke Carver, tall, broad-shouldered, and hollow-eyed, a man who looked like the land he worked, weathered, worn, fading. Luke tugged on his hat brim as he stood at the corral, looking down at the lifeless body of his last strong horse. The creature lay still under the tree's shadow, ribs showing, eyes already glazed with the peace that only death brings. Luke squatted down beside it, ran a calloused hand along its neck, and whispered, "You did good, Scout, real good." Then he stood, heavy and wordless, and walked back toward the house. That morning he brewed coffee so weak it tasted like memories. The cupboard was nearly bare. No sugar, no flour, no oats. Just a cracked tin of beans and a man running out of road. Luke didn't have many friends left in town. Most folks had packed up and gone east once the river dried up and the crops turned to dust. Those who remained kept their heads down and their pockets tight. But Luke had one last thing he could do. Tried to buy a horse. He needed one. Without it, he couldn't haul feed, couldn't check the distant fence lines, couldn't make it into town without borrowing. And Luke Carver never borrowed. Not even when things got this bad, so he saddled the old mule, half blind and too stubborn to die, and set off down the winding trail toward Dry Creek Junction, where old men with wet cigars and cracked lips auctioned off tired animals in the scorching sun. It was a dusty, narrow town with 2 saloons, 1 church, and too many secrets. The mule's hooves kicked up dust like regrets as Luke reached the market square. He dismounted, spat dryly into the dirt, and walked through the gates of the auction yard. Livestock bleated and brayed all around him, thin goats, underfed cows, and horses that looked more like shadows than work animals. He scanned them with the eyes of a man who'd been raised on a ranch and could tell a bad tendon or a sick eye from 20 paces. Nothing here was worth buying. Not for the few dollars he had stuffed in his worn boot. He paused by the corral fence, staring at a chestnut mare whose limp told him she wouldn't last through winter. He shook his head and was about to walk on when he heard a voice, small, soft, barely above the sound of the wind. "Please, take me instead." Luke turned. Behind the barn, crouched beside a stack of hay bales, was a girl, maybe 15, 16 tops. She was barefoot. Her hair was matted with dirt. A thin gray dress hung on her like rags, torn at the seams and stained with what he guessed wasn't just mud. Her eyes wide, sunken, and impossibly blue met his with a mix of terror and hope that chilled him more than a bullet. He stepped forward slowly. "What did you just say?" She stood, legs trembling. Her hands were clenched in front of her. "I said," her voice cracked, "take me instead, please. I can work. I'll clean, feed the animals, fix things. Just don't leave me." "Here?" Luke frowned, scanning her for signs of a trick. "Where's your folks?" The girl swallowed. "Dead. Just me now. My uncle, he says I'm good for nothing. Tried to trade me for whiskey last week. He said today he's selling me for a mule or a horse." Luke's mouth went dry. She glanced toward the side of the barn. "He's with the auctioneer. Told me to wait out of sight so I don't spook buyers." Luke followed her gaze. Sure enough, he saw a man in a torn vest, greasy hat tilted low, arguing with the auctioneer. Every once in a while, the man jerked his thumb back toward the barn. "Your name?" Luke asked. "Rosie." She said it like she hadn't used it in a while. Luke looked her over again. She had bruises on her arms, a cut above her brow. She wasn't lying. He exhaled, long and slow, and stepped away from her. He needed to think. He didn't come here for trouble. He came here for a horse, damn it. What would he do with a half-starved girl? He didn't even have enough food for himself. This was someone else's problem. Someone with money. A preacher. A sheriff. A woman. But the look in her eyes kept him from walking away. He turned on his heel and marched across the dusty lot toward the auctioneer's booth. The greasy man saw him coming and puffed up like a toad. "What do you want, stranger?" Luke didn't answer him. He looked at the auctioneer. "He trying to sell that girl?" The auctioneer gave a sheepish shrug. He said she's part of a package. Offered her up with that old gray Mari. Package. Huh, Luke growled. You run auctions for livestock. She ain't livestock. The greasy man shoved Luke. You don't get to tell me what to do with my kin. She's mine till she's married or buried. And if I say she's part of the sale, then she damn well is. Luke didn't flinch. Instead, he reached down, pulled the last of his savings from his boot, 4 worn bills and some silver coins, and slapped them on the crate. Take it, that's all I got. The man looked down at the money, then back at Luke. What's this for? For her. You let her go now, and I don't break your teeth. The man stared at him, jaw twitching. Then, with a snarl, he grabbed the money and stormed off, muttering curses. Luke turned back to the auctioneer. She's free? The man nodded slowly. Far as I'm concerned. Luke walked back to the barn. Rosie was still standing there, eyes wide. Come on, he said. Let's go. She hesitated. You sure? I ain't gonna say it twice. She followed. They didn't talk much on the way back to the ranch. Rosie rode behind him on the old mule, silent, arms wrapped around her thin middle. Luke didn't look back once, but he felt her trembling, like a sparrow in a storm. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the broken fences. And tired ground. Luke helped her down. Barn's clean. You can sleep there tonight. Got some beans on the stove if you're hungry. Rosie nodded, eyes darting around like she didn't believe any of it was real. Luke turned toward the house, then paused. I didn't buy you. Rosie, he said, without looking back. I just bought you a second chance. What you do with, it's up to you. Then he stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him. The wind howled that night, slapping the shutters of the ranch house and rattling the tin roof like a bad omen. Inside, Luke Carver sat at the kitchen table, staring into a chipped tin mug. The coffee had long gone cold. He hadn't touched it. Since he poured it. Outside, in the barn, Rosie lay curled on a pile of hay, her thin arms wrapped around herself. The air was cold, and she had only a frayed wool blanket that Luke had left out earlier. It smelled of horses and oil and something else. Safety. A feeling unfamiliar to her. She stared up at the rafters. The silence was so thick. It frightened her more than shouting ever had. Her uncle had shouted a lot. She hadn't expected anyone to take her seriously when she whispered those words. Please take me instead, she just said them. Her last act of defiance. A prayer into the wind. But somehow, this hard-looking man with storm-gray eyes had heard her and answered. Rosie didn't understand it. Why would someone like him want someone like her? She drifted into uneasy sleep, flinching every time the wind slammed something shut. Morning came with pale gray skies and a bitter chill. Rosie woke to the sounds of boots crunching gravel outside. She peeked through the barn slats. Luke was already up, hauling water in rusted buckets and feeding the scrawny chickens. He worked with mechanical precision, no wasted motion, no words. Just purpose. Rosie crept out and stood near the barn door. Her dress fluttered in the wind, and her bare feet burned on the cold earth. Luke glanced up but didn't speak. She took a step forward. I can help. He looked at her, eyebrows drawn low. You any good with chickens? She shrugged. I used to feed some back home. He nodded toward the coop. Then start there. She moved fast, eager to be useful. She scooped grain, filled the troughs, and chased 2 stubborn hens out from under the porch. Luke said nothing but kept his eyes on her. She was quick, careful, and didn't complain once at midday he called her into the house and slid a plate of beans and dry cornbread across the table. She stared at it. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No, sir. Just wasn't sure if it was really for me." "You worked. You eat," he said simply. She nodded and ate like someone afraid the food might disappear. Over the next few days, Rosie made herself useful. She swept the porch, washed clothes in the creek, patched holes in old shirts. She even fixed a broken latch on the chicken coop. She didn't ask for much, just a dry place to sleep and a bit of food. Every time Luke tried to pay her a compliment, she flinched like he might hit her instead. He didn't, but it made something. Not in his chest every time she recoiled. On the 4th day, he caught her talking to the mule. She sat beside it, brushing its scraggly mane and whispering to it like it was a baby. Luke watched from the shadows. She looked peaceful there, like she belonged to the land somehow, even with all the hurt she carried. That night, he knocked gently on the barn door. She sat up from the hay. "You're not a prisoner here, Rosie," he said. "I know," she whispered. "You can sleep in the house. Got a spare room. Hasn't been used in years, but it's got a bed." She hesitated. "I'll stay here," she said softly. Luke nodded once, then turned away. He didn't ask again. One afternoon, Luke took her into town. Supplies were low. They rode the mule together, Rosie holding the reins while Luke pointed out the trail. People stared when they reached the general store. Whispers followed them like flies. "That's the Carver girl. Heard he bought her from her uncle. Poor thing. Looks like she's been through a war." Luke didn't answer the looks. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight. Inside the store, Rosie's hands hovered over a can of peaches. She picked it up, looked at Luke. He nodded. "Go ahead." Her smile was small, but it warmed the coldest part of him. Back outside, a man leaned against a post and sneered. "Mighty strange thing, bringing home a girl like that, Carver. What you plannin' to do with her?" Luke didn't look at him, just kept walking, but Rosie's cheeks burned with shame. Later that night, she sat on the porch, her knees hugged to her chest. Luke stepped outside, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He offered one to her. She took it, grateful even if she didn't like the taste. "They think I'm nothin'," she said suddenly. "Just a thing. Some ragged, unwanted mistake." Luke looked at her. "You're not a thing, Rosie. You're a person. And you matter." She stared into her cup. "Why'd you help me?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because I could," and that was enough. The days grew colder. Rosie began waking early, sometimes before Luke. She cooked, though it was usually just beans and biscuits. She hung laundry on the fence line, sang to the chickens, and once fixed the porch step without being asked. Luke started calling her kiddo. She smiled when he said it. Still, she jumped every time a horse passed the trail. Fear didn't leave her easily. One evening, Luke found her in the barn, tears slipping down her face as she held a worn photograph. It was cracked and faded, a woman, maybe her mother, with the same blue eyes. "She used to sing to me," Rosie whispered. "Even when there wasn't any food," she sang. Luke sat beside her, saying nothing. That night, he put a second blanket in the barn. A quiet gesture. Rosie found it and smiled through tears. 1 week after Rosie came, a letter arrived. Luke rarely got mail, but this one was from the local sheriff. The note was short. "The girl's uncle has filed a complaint. Says you kidnapped her. Wants her back. We'll come visit." Luke crushed the letter in his fist. That night, he told Rosie. Her hand shook. "He'll take me back." "No," Luke said firmly. Not while I'm breathing. But the law, I'll talk to the sheriff. You're safe here. She looked up at him with eyes full of fear and hope. You sure? He nodded. I didn't bring you here to let you be taken again. For the first time, she reached out and took his hand. Not as a servant. Not as a burden, but as someone starting to believe she could trust. Morning light slanted through the barn slats, catching the dust in soft rays. Rosie lay wrapped in her blanket, eyes already open. She hadn't slept much. Her uncle's name still rang in her ears from the sheriff's letter Luke had shown her. The night before, she had escaped once. But men like her uncle always came back. They didn't forget. They didn't forgive. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. Her heart pounded at every creak of the wind. But she reminded herself, this is not that place. He's not that man. She repeated it until her breath evened out outside. The ranch was slowly waking. Luke moved with that same calm strength she was growing used to. Not soft, not cold, just steady, solid. He was already in the chicken yard when she joined him, bundled in a too large coat he'd left for her last night. You're up early, he said, without looking up. Can't sleep much these days. He gave a small grunt, the closest thing to sympathy he usually showed. She watched the chickens for a while, then asked, Still going to town today? Luke nodded. Sheriff wants a word, Rosie swallowed. Want me to come? He looked. At her then, really looked. Not this time, not yet. She nodded. She understood. Some things were better handled alone. The ride to town was long and silent for Luke. He didn't care for talking unless it meant something. As he trotted past the edge of Dry Creek Junction, folks turned their heads. The news about Rosie had spread faster than prairie fire dot at the sheriff's office. Sheriff Porter leaned back in his creaky chair, hands folded over his gut. Carver, he said. Heard you brought home a girl, Rosie Burnham. I did, Luke said. She was being sold like an old saddle. I stepped in. Sheriff Porter scratched his beard. Her uncle's claiming she's his legal kin. Says you stole her. I gave him every cent I had. She asked to come. You think I'd taken a half-starved kid for fun? Porter sighed. You know how it is, Luke. Law don't always line up with right and wrong. He ain't her father, but he's her guardian. Guardian. Don't mean anything if he's using her like trade goods. Porter leaned forward. You'll need to prove she's better off with you. Otherwise, he can force it through the circuit judge next month. Luke stood. He comes to my ranch again. He's leaving in a wagon or a box. The sheriff didn't argue. Back at the ranch, Rosie busied herself. She swept the house, beat out the rugs, patched 2 shirts with missing buttons. Anything to keep her hands moving. But when Luke returned, his face told her everything. He's not done, she whispered. No, Luke said. But neither are we. That night, she moved into the spare room. She didn't ask. Luke didn't offer. But after dinner, she simply stood beside the hallway and looked at him. He gave the barest nod. Door sticks a bit. She smiled. Inside, the room was musty and forgotten. A bed, a dresser, a cracked mirror. She touched the quilt hand-stitched old, but clean. She ran her fingers over the wooden headboard, the initials carved into it. LC and RC, Luke's and someone else's. She lay down and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, she didn't cry before sleep found her. The next few weeks passed like that slow and uncertain. Luke worked the land while Rosie found her rhythm. She built a chicken feeder out of spare planks, learned to boil water on the old stove without burning her hands, and even figured out how to bake hard biscuits that didn't taste like mud. Sometimes Luke would leave a single coin or two on the table after a long day. She never spent them, just kept them in a little wooden box under her bed like treasure. The mule became her closest companion. She named him Bruno. He tolerated her songs and followed her around the yard like a moody shadow, but even peace. As it storms. One night, while cleaning the barn, Rosie heard hoofbeats fast and sharp. She ducked behind a bale of hay. From the dark, her uncle's voice rang out, loud, drunk. "Carver, you in there? I know you got my niece." "The hell you think you're doing, playing house with a kid that ain't yours?" She trembled. Her body remembered every blow, every scream, every locked door. Luke stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. "She ain't yours," he said. "She is by law." "You can't just take a child, Carver. That's stealing." Luke's voice was ice. "She's not cattle, not a coin to trade. You want to fight, you're looking at it." Her uncle spat on the dirt. "You think you're some hero? Wait till the judge hears about this. I'll see you in chains." Luke didn't flinch. "You ever come here again, you'll leave with a limp." The man swore, turned, and galloped off into the night. Only then did Rosie crawl out from hiding. Luke saw her shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want this to be your trouble." He didn't answer at first. Then, he was always going to be your trouble. Now he's mine too. The next day, Luke rode to the church in town and spoke with the preacher. Quietly, firmly, he left with a piece of paper, a statement of character and witness of her uncle's behavior. Then, he visited Mrs. Daly, the widow who ran the little schoolhouse. She had seen Rosie once before. Luke asked if she'd be willing to vouch for her, maybe even teach her a few things. Mrs. Daly agreed after some persuasion and a good deal of coffee. Luke returned that night with books and supplies. Rosie's eyes lit up when she saw them. "You're gonna learn," he said. "Letters, numbers, your rights." She hugged the books tight to her chest. "I ain't never had a right before." "You do now." That week, a letter came. Her uncle was pushing the matter into court. They had a month to prepare. Luke told her gently. Her face fell, but she didn't cry. Instead, she said, "I'll do whatever it takes. I ain't going back." He looked at her. This girl in rags who'd cleaned his porch, fed his mule, stood between him and the silence, and saw someone becoming something new. "You won't," he said. Then added, "Not on my watch." The air turned cold that week, the kind of cold that crept under doors and stiffened bones. Even the mule walked slower. The sky stayed gray for days, like the heavens were holding their breath. Inside the ranch house, Rosie sat by the window, practicing her letters on old scrap paper with a piece of coal. Her tongue poked out in concentration as she wrote Rosie, each letter shakily curved into the next, like her feet learning to walk again. Across the room, Luke sat at the table repairing a saddle strap. He looked up once, watching her form the E with her left hand curled like a claw. "You'll wear that stick down to dust if you grip it that tight," he said. She gave a small, sheepish smile and loosened her hold. The silence between them was never heavy anymore. It lived gently, like an old friend sitting between them, letting them breathe. The next morning, the wind turned violent. It slammed into the ranch like a beast ripping laundry off the line, rattling windows and throwing branches down like they were made of straw. Rosie and Luke worked all day nailing shut shutters, tying tarps, and securing the animals. When night came, the storm only worsened. Rosie sat near the fire, curled in a blanket, shivering. "Feels like the house might fly away." Luke poured her a mug of tea, strong, bitter, but warm. "If it does, we'll build another." She smiled, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind reminded her too much of the nights her uncle came home drunk, slamming things, yelling, and worse. Around midnight, she crept down the hallway and stood at Luke's door. He didn't sleep much either. "You all right?" he asked without opening his eyes. "Can't stop shaking." He sat up and motioned toward the chair in the corner. "You can stay." Sit if you want." She nodded, entered, and curled up in the chair by the dying fire. Neither spoke. Eventually, the wind calmed, and Rosie, watching the soft orange glow of coals, whispered, "My mama died when I was 8. Luke's gaze shifted to her shadowed face. She used to sing to me, even when there was no food, even when she knew we were gonna get hit for it." She swallowed hard. "After she died, my uncle came. Said he'd raise me. He didn't. He just owned me." Luke's jaw clenched, but he let her speak. "I ran once. A family took me in. But when he found me, he made sure I didn't try again. Said if I told anyone, he'd bury me where no one would look." Her voice cracked then, but she didn't cry. "Then I saw you at that auction. I didn't expect you to help. I just thought maybe, if I said it, someone might finally see me." Luke stared at the embers. "I saw you." She looked over. "And I see you now." She gave a tiny nod, then whispered, "I'm scared." "I am too," he replied, and that was the truest thing he'd said in years. In the following days, Rosie changed. Something in her had shifted, not broken, but cracked open. She stopped flinching at every sound. She walked taller. She even started humming while washing dishes. It was the same song her mama used to sing. One morning, Luke found her out back, hammering a sign together out of driftwood and wire. She nailed it to the fence post near the road. It read, "Home." He didn't say a word, just nodded once. But peace, like anything precious, is always threatened. Late one afternoon, Luke spotted a rider in the distance. He stood at the porch, hand on his rifle. Rosie came beside him. "Is it him?" Luke's eyes narrowed. "Yeah." Rosie stepped back, her breath catching. The horseman slowed as he approached. "Her uncle. Same hat, same foul sneer." But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 other men followed behind, one lean and wiry with a scar down his cheek, the other stocky and red-faced. Luke stepped forward. "Turn around," he said. Her uncle grinned. "Court's coming up fast, Cowboy. Just thought we'd check on our little Rosie. Make sure you ain't been mistreating her like you say I did." Luke didn't move. "You bring muscle to threaten a child? Just witnesses. Friends of mine. You got no papers, no legal right." Rosie appeared behind Luke then, fists clenched. "You sold me," she said coldly. "You told men I was worth less than a mule." The uncle scoffed. "Don't twist the story, girl. You're confused." "I ain't confused," she snapped. "You hit me, starved me, locked me in sheds for days. That's why Mama left me with strangers before she died, because she knew you'd do this." The 2 men looked at each other. Luke raised the rifle slightly. "You best leave, now." The uncle scowled, but fear crept into his eyes. "You'll regret this. Both of you." "We already did," Luke said. "Now get." They turned and rode off, dust trailing behind them like smoke. Rosie stood frozen for a long time. Then she whispered, "I think I just beat my monster." That night, Luke made dinner. Not beans this time, but real stew, with chunks of meat and even carrots. Rosie grinned ear to ear. "I didn't know you could cook," she teased. "I didn't either," Luke replied. They ate in peace, no words needed. But after dishes, Rosie approached him and said, "Thank you for standing up, for not backing down." Luke looked her in the eyes. "You stood up too." She smiled. Then, carefully, she said, "I think I'm ready now for court." "For?" "Whatever comes." Luke nodded slowly. "You won't be alone." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I know." A soft spring wind moved through the dry land, lifting dust and old memories. The fields around Carver Ranch hadn't bloomed in years, but something was changing. The soil still cracked, the fences still sagged, and the mules still grumbled. Every time Rosie asked him to move, but there was life again. Luke noticed it first in the mornings. The girl who once flinched at her own shadow now opened the barn door humming. She had learned the art of movement quiet but strong. She knew when to patch a fence, when to comfort a spooked animal, and how to boil the coffee without burning it. Rosie wasn't just surviving now. She was becoming. One morning, Rosie handed Luke a folded piece of paper. Her handwriting was crooked, but every letter was careful. It read, "To the judge, my name is Rosie Burnham, and I don't want to go back. I live with Mr. Luke Carver, and I feel safe. I get to sleep in a room. I get to eat real food. I get to wake up and not be scared. I get to be me." Luke held the note like it was glass. His hands, strong enough to build barns, trembled at the words. "You sure you want to give him this?" he asked. She nodded. "It's the first thing I've ever written that mattered." A few days later, Luke hitched up the wagon and told Rosie to come along. She hadn't been into town since her uncle's last visit. "I can handle it," she said. "You will," Luke replied. They arrived during the market rush. People stared as usual, but this time Rosie didn't look down. She held her head high. Luke led her toward the far end of town, past the saloon and the mercantile, toward a faded barn where a horse trader had set up shop. Luke had heard word there were new animals in town, and if there was any hope for the ranch, he'd need one. Rosie stood by the fence, watching. Then she noticed something. The trader, an old man with a gray beard and clever eyes, was talking fast to a young rancher who clearly didn't know the first thing about horses. The man was about to buy a lame gelding for too much money. Rosie stepped forward. "Sir," she said, polite but firm, "that horse limps on the back left. He'll go lame within a week if he's worked too hard. You'd do better with the palomino tied behind." Both men turned to her. The trader raised an eyebrow. "You got an eye, miss." "She's worked around horses her whole life," Luke said from behind her. "Knows more than most grown men." The rancher took the palomino instead. The trader turned to Rosie. "You ever trade?" "No, sir." "Well, how about you do now?" By the end of the day, Rosie had helped Luke trade their excess feed for a sturdy workhorse, plus a spare saddle. She also bartered 2 patched quilts for fresh eggs and managed to talk down a pair of boots in her size. Luke watched her like someone seeing color for the first time. When they climbed back into the wagon, Rosie beamed. "That was kind of fun." "You just saved the ranch 6 months of trouble," she grinned. "Guess I earned my coffee tonight." "You earned a whole lot more than that." That evening, Luke went into the storage shed. He dug through old trunks until he found what he was looking for, a thin silver locket, worn and simple. He held it for a long moment, remembering the woman who used to wear it, Rebecca, his wife, the one who died too young, too kind, too full of hope. She would have liked Rosie. Maybe that's why he could still breathe. He brought it inside and placed it on the table during dinner. Rosie stared at it. "What's this?" "Something that belonged to someone who meant a lot to me," Luke said. "Figured maybe it's time it meant something to someone again." She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a pressed blue flower and a tiny photo. Luke, years younger, beside a smiling woman. "Is this her?" He nodded. "She always said I'd find someone worth protecting again. I didn't believe her. Not until now." Rosie didn't speak. She closed the locket and clutched it to her chest like a promise. The next morning, Rosie woke before dawn. She saddled the new horse whom she named Lucky and rode the perimeter of the ranch. The fences were still worn, but the wind felt different on her face. When she returned, Luke stood at the porch. "You ride like you were born to," he said. She laughed. "Maybe I was. Or maybe the old Rosie got left behind with the rags." They shared coffee on the steps, both watching the sun rise over the hills. But the peace didn't last long. A letter arrived 3 days before the court hearing. The uncle's lawyer was making claims lies about Rosie stealing, accusing Luke of hiding her, manipulating her for labor. Luke crushed the letter in his fist. We'll fight it. Rosie didn't cry. She sat down and picked up her practice papers. If I can learn to read, she said, I can learn to speak for myself. And she did. Every night, Luke coached her. Speak slow. Look them in the eyes. Tell the truth. Rosie repeated her answers. Her voice grew stronger with every try. The day before court, Mrs. Daly came to visit. She brought Rosie a pale, yellow dress with small flower stitching on the sleeves. Rosie touched the fabric like it might vanish. I can't take this. You can, Mrs. Daly said, and you will. You're not a ragged girl anymore, Rosie. You're somebody. That night, Luke stood outside her room, listening to her pray, not for revenge, not even for justice, just to stay, just to be allowed a life. He turned away, eyes burning, inside his chest. Something heavy lifted and something unspoken settled in its place. He wasn't just protecting Rosie anymore. He was raising her. The courthouse smelled like old books and older wood, like something sacred and stiff. Rosie stood just outside the door with Luke beside her. Her hands were cold, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't the same girl he found in the mud behind the stables. That girl was gone. She had buried her in the soil of the ranch, under every fence mended, every dish washed. Every dawn she'd risen before the rooster. Luke touched her shoulder. No matter what happens in there, you're mine. You hear me? She looked up at him. I hear you. The judge was already seated, a long-bearded man in a dusty robe who'd seen too much over the years. Across the room sat Mr. Burnham, her uncle, stuffed in a black coat that barely fit over his belly, his eyes hard and triumphant. He smirked when he saw Rosie. She didn't flinch. They took their seats. First, the uncle's lawyer spoke. Spat. Outlies polished like pearls. She ran away from home. She stole money from her kin. She's being manipulated by this man, Mr. Carver. She's a child unfit to speak for herself. Luke was called. He stood, his shoulders wide and worn, and spoke slow. She came to me with bruises and no shoes. I never asked her to stay. She begged me. She sleeps under a roof. Now she eats real food, and she smiles. The lawyer tried to twist his words. Luke didn't rise to it. I ain't her father, he said, but I reckon I love her just the same. Then Rosie was called. She walked to the stand in that pale yellow dress. The courtroom hushed. Her hands shook as she took the oath. But her voice did not. My name is Rosie Burnham. I'm 15 years old. She looked the judge in the eye. I lived with my uncle since my mama died. He made me work. If I was sick, he beat me. If I was slow, he cursed me. I had no bed. I had no say. Her uncle grunted, but the judge silenced him. She continued. Then Mr. Carver came to buy a horse. I saw him from the barn. I didn't know his name, but I saw something good in his eyes. So I ran to him. Her voice cracked, but she pushed. On, I said, take me instead, and he did. Tears welled in her eyes, but he didn't take me like my uncle meant. He gave me a room, a coat, books, coffee in the morning. He made me feel like a person again. The courtroom held its breath. I ain't asking to live in a palace, just a home where I'm safe, with someone who listens when I speak. She turned, looked directly at the judge. I'm not a thing to be passed around. I'm not a burden. I'm not broken. I'm Rosie Carver now. If the law don't like that, then the law's never met me. The judge sat back. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he cleared his throat. Miss Burnham, Rosie. You've spoken more truth in 10 minutes than I've heard in 10 years of court. I'd be a fool to send you back. Rosie gasped softly. The judge continued. Effective immediately, guardianship is granted to Mr. Luke Carver. And I recommend the county help with fees for education and housing. Her uncle stood up in a rage. She's blood. She belongs to me. The judge banged the gavel once. You lost that right the day you raised a hand to her. Outside the courthouse, Rosie collapsed into Luke's arms. She didn't cry. She just breathed. She'd never known what freedom tasted like until now. Back at the ranch, things didn't magically get easier. They still struggled for money. The cows still got sick sometimes. But laughter became more frequent. So did peace. Rosie planted sunflowers near the porch. Luke built a bookshelf in her room. She read every night by lantern light, whispering words like they were spells. One summer day, months later, Rosie stood at the edge of the property, staring into the distance. Luke joined her. "What are you thinking?" "I was thinking," she said softly, "maybe I'll teach little girls one day, the kind who don't believe they're worth nothing. I'll teach 'em they are." Luke smiled. "You already taught one man that." As the sun dipped low, painting the land in gold, they stood together, rancher and daughter, not by blood, but by choice. The end.